When Sweden decided to leverage its financial aid as a weapon against Mali, little did they expect the African nation to respond with defiance rather than submission.
The latest escalation in tensions between France and Mali.
The French ambassador in Bamako, His Excellency Joel Mayer, has been summoned by the Minister of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperation. During this exchange, he was told about the decision taken by the government to ask him to leave the country within 72 hours.
Mali, once thought to be under Sweden's influence, has ordered Sweden's ambassador to leave within 72 hours. But when did the oppressed become this powerful? The tables have turned. Africa is not the same. So, will the ambassador leave? Or will Sweden force Mali to comply? Let's find out. The recent diplomatic spat between Mali and Sweden has highlighted the growing tensions between African sovereignty and Western influence. After Sweden threatened to cut off aid due to Mali's relationship with Russia, the Malian government swiftly expelled the Swedish ambassador, signaling a refusal to be coerced by foreign powers. This incident is more than just a diplomatic disagreement. It is a microcosm of the larger struggle for African independence from neo-colonial pressures. For decades, African nations have been entangled in dependency on Western aid, often finding themselves at the mercy of donor nations that use financial assistance as a tool of influence. The relationship between Mali and Sweden is a case in point. As Sweden, under the pretext of moral high ground, attempted to dictate Mali's foreign policy choices, Mali made a historic decision to push back, asserting its right to sovereignty and self-determination. But wasn't the West trying to only help Mali? Why is it that Western aid, which is ostensibly meant to assist developing nations, always seems to come with conditions that ignore their sovereignty? The history of Western aid to Africa is a history of control and manipulation, thinly veiled under the guise of philanthropy and international cooperation. From the very onset of independence, African nations were thrust into a global system designed to maintain the economic and political dominance of their former colonizers. Western powers, unwilling to let go of their influence over these newly independent states, crafted a system of aid that was less about development and more about ensuring that African nations remained tethered to their former masters. Aid packages are rarely offered without conditions. These conditions often include demands for structural adjustments, economic reforms, and even political realignments that are designed to benefit the donor rather than the recipient. The International Monetary Fund (IMF) and the World Bank, institutions largely controlled by Western interests, have been at the forefront of this strategy, enforcing policies that have crippled African economies and plunged millions into poverty. Structural adjustment programs, for example, have required African governments to cut public spending, privatize state-owned enterprises, and open up their markets to foreign competition, all in the name of economic efficiency. However, the reality is that these policies have often served to entrench Western economic interests at the expense of local industries and livelihoods. In countries like Mali, these policies have led to the dismantling of vital public services, the erosion of social safety nets, and the concentration of wealth in the hands of a few elites, many of whom are aligned with foreign powers. This is the true face of Western aid, a tool of control, designed to keep African nations dependent on the very powers that once colonized them. The recent ultimatum from Sweden to Mali is an example of how Western powers continue to use aid as a means of exerting influence over African nations. By threatening to cut off aid due to Mali's relationship with Russia, Sweden was not simply expressing displeasure. It was attempting to dictate Mali's foreign policy, to ensure that Mali's alliances align with Western interests. This is a familiar tactic, using economic leverage to force compliance with Western geopolitical strategies. But what happens when a nation like Mali refuses to play by these rules? Here's a reminder to please like and share the video, and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Mali's decision to expel the Swedish ambassador is a powerful rejection of this dynamic. It's a statement that Mali will not be bought or bullied into submission, and that it will not allow its foreign policy to be dictated by external forces. This act of defiance is emblematic of a broader resistance across Africa to the paternalistic attitudes of the West. nations are beginning to realize that true sovereignty cannot coexist with dependency on foreign aid that comes with conditions attached. The symbolism of Mali's decision is profound. It represents a break from the past, a rejection of the neo-colonial tactics that have kept Africa in a state of dependency for far too long. For decades, the West has operated under the assumption that financial aid gives them the right to meddle in the internal affairs of recipient countries, often with disastrous consequences. The imposition of Western ideals, whether through forced economic liberalization or political restructuring, has frequently destabilized societies, undermined local economies, and exacerbated social inequalities. The case of Sweden and Mali is but one example in a long history of similar incidents. Whether it was the structural adjustment programs of the 1980s that crippled many African economies, or the more recent demands for austerity measures that have plunged nations into deeper poverty, Western aid has often been more of a curse than a blessing. And yet, many African nations have found themselves trapped in this cycle, unable to break free from the dependency that Western aid fosters. Given the known pitfalls, why do so many African nations continue to accept aid from Western countries, even when it compromises their autonomy? The acceptance of conditional aid by African nations is not simply a matter of choice. It is often born out of necessity, shaped by the harsh realities of post-colonial underdevelopment and global economic pressures. For many African countries, the immediate need for financial support to address pressing issues such as poverty, infrastructure development, and healthcare outweighs the long-term consequences of dependency. This is the tragic paradox faced by many African leaders. They must deal in a world where the scales are tipped heavily in favor of those who control the purse strings. The legacy of colonialism has left many African nations with weak economies, underdeveloped infrastructure, and a lack of access to global markets. These structural challenges, coupled with the effects of global economic policies that often disadvantage developing nations, have made it incredibly difficult for African countries to achieve self-sustaining growth. As a result, many African governments find themselves with little choice but to turn to foreign aid as a means of addressing these challenges. However, the very nature of this aid often exacerbates the problems it is meant to solve. Conditional aid, particularly from Western nations, typically requires recipient countries to implement policies that align with the donor's economic and political interests. This can include demands for privatization, trade liberalization, and fiscal austerity, measures that may benefit foreign investors but often harm local industries and populations. The result is a cycle of dependency, where African nations become reliant on foreign aid to maintain their economies, even as the conditions attached to this aid undermine their long-term development prospects. Moreover, the political implications of accepting conditional aid cannot be ignored. In many cases, the conditions attached to aid are designed to influence the domestic and foreign policies of the recipient country. This can include requirements to align with the donor's geopolitical interests, such as supporting certain international initiatives or adopting specific stances in global forums. The result is a form of neo-colonialism, where African nations are pressured to conform to the wishes of foreign powers in exchange for financial support. This cycle of dependency is not only economic, but also psychological. Decades of reliance on foreign aid have fostered a mindset among many African leaders that equates survival with compliance. The fear of economic collapse, coupled with the constant threat of aid withdrawal, has created an environment where sovereignty is often sacrificed for short-term gains. This is the tragic reality that many African nations face: the choice between economic survival and political autonomy. Despite these challenges, some African leaders have sought to break free from this cycle of dependency. The decision by Mali's government to expel the Swedish ambassador and reject Sweden's conditional aid is a bold example of this. By prioritizing sovereignty over short-term financial gain, Mali is making a statement that it will not allow its policies to be dictated by foreign donors. This is a risky move, but it reflects a growing sentiment across the continent that African nations must take control of their destinies, even if it means facing economic hardship in the short term. The question then is, how did Mali reach this point? What gave its leaders the confidence to take such a stand against a powerful Western nation? To understand this, we must explore the historical and political context that has shaped Mali's current government and its determination to assert its independence. Mali's current government came to power under extraordinary circumstances, marked by a period of political upheaval and widespread dissatisfaction with the status quo. The coup d'etat that brought the new leadership to power was not just a routine change of government. It was a revolt against a system that had long failed to serve the interests of the Malian people. The previous administration, widely seen as a puppet of Western interests, was perceived to be more concerned with maintaining the favor of foreign powers than with addressing the needs of its citizens. The coup was driven by a combination of factors, including frustration with rampant corruption, economic mismanagement, and the ongoing insecurity caused by insurgent groups in the north of the country. But perhaps most significantly, it was fueled by a deep-seated resentment of the influence that Western powers, particularly France, continued to wield over Mali's political and economic affairs. The presence of French troops in Mali, ostensibly to combat terrorism, was seen by many as a continuation of colonial control, and the government's close ties to France were viewed with increasing suspicion. The new government that emerged from the coup was determined to chart a different course. Its leaders, many of whom had grown disillusioned with the West's paternalistic approach to Africa, sought to assert Mali's sovereignty in a way that had not been done before. This included reassessing Mali's foreign alliances and seeking out new partnerships that would allow the country to pursue its interests without being beholden to Western powers. One of the most significant shifts in Mali's foreign policy has been its rapprochement with Russia. In contrast to the West, Russia presents itself as a partner that respects the sovereignty of other nations and does not impose its will through conditional aid or military interventions. For Mali, aligning with Russia offered an opportunity to reduce its reliance on Western support and to gain a more balanced set of international relationships. This shift in alliances did not go unnoticed by the West. Sweden's decision to cut off aid to Mali was a direct response to this new alignment, a clear attempt to pressure Mali back into the Western fold. However, Mali's leaders were prepared for this confrontation. The decision to expel the Swedish ambassador was not made in haste. It was a calculated move that reflected the government's commitment to maintaining its newfound independence. Mali's defiance is rooted in a broader regional context as well. Across West Africa, there has been a growing pushback against the lingering influence of former colonial powers. Countries like Burkina Faso and Niger have also experienced political shifts that reflect a desire to break free from the neo-colonial relationships that have dominated the region since independence. These changes are often accompanied by a resurgence of nationalist sentiment and a re-evaluation of the role that foreign powers should play in domestic affairs. In this context, Mali's actions can be seen as part of a larger movement towards reclaiming sovereignty and resisting external control. The government's willingness to defy Sweden, and by extension the broader Western alliance, signals a broader rejection of the idea that African nations must align their policies with the interests of former colonial powers. This is a significant shift, and it raises important questions about the future of international relations in Africa. Mali's leaders have demonstrated a willingness to embrace risk in the pursuit of sovereignty, understanding that true independence requires the courage to challenge the status quo. This is a lesson that resonates across the continent, where many nations are grappling with the legacy of colonialism and the ongoing influence of Western powers. Mali's stance is a powerful reminder that sovereignty is not given. It is taken, often at great cost. With the stage set for Mali's defiance, it's crucial to analyze the possible repercussions of this decision, both for Mali itself and for the broader African continent. What risks does Mali face in standing up to Sweden and, by extension, the West? How might this impact its future and that of the broader African continent? Mali's decision to expel the Swedish ambassador and reject conditional aid is undeniably a bold move, but it comes with significant risks. In the short term, Mali may face a range of economic and diplomatic repercussions. The loss of Swedish aid, while not catastrophic on its own, could be compounded by similar actions from other Western nations, leading to a broader withdrawal of financial support. Moreover, Mali risks diplomatic isolation as Western nations close ranks in response to its defiance. This isolation could manifest in various ways, from reduced trade opportunities to exclusion from international forums, where key decisions about global development are made. The West's influence over global institutions such as the IMF and the World Bank means that Mali could face additional financial pressures if these institutions decide to withhold loans or impose punitive measures in response to its actions. However, the Malian government appears to have calculated that these risks are worth taking in the pursuit of long-term sovereignty. The current leadership seems to believe that the benefits of rejecting neo-colonial control outweigh the costs of short-term economic hardship. This is a bold calculation, and its success will depend on Mali's ability to build new alliances and secure alternative sources of funding. One potential consequence of this decision is that Mali may increasingly turn to non-Western nations, such as Russia and China, for support. These countries, while not free from their strategic interests, often offer aid and investment with fewer political strings attached. By diversifying its international partnerships, Mali could reduce its dependency on Western aid and increase its bargaining power on the global stage. This could lead to a reconfiguration of Mali's foreign relations, where the country moves away from its traditional Western allies and towards a more multipolar set of relationships. There is also a symbolic dimension to Mali's decision. By standing up to Western power, Mali is setting an example for other African nations, showing that it is possible to reject the conditions imposed by foreign aid and still survive. This could inspire a wave of similar actions across the continent, further weakening the West's grip on Africa. If other nations follow Mali's lead, it could lead to a broader realignment of global power, where African nations assert their sovereignty and reject the paternalistic attitudes that have long characterized their relationships with the West. Now the question is, how does Mali's stance impact the broader struggle for African sovereignty in the face of global pressures? What lessons can other African nations draw from Mali's experience? Mali's bold stance is not just a national issue. It is a significant moment in the broader struggle for African sovereignty. In a globalized world where economic and political power is often concentrated in the hands of a few Western nations, African countries have historically struggled to assert their independence. The use of aid as a tool of coercion is just one of the many ways in which the West has maintained its influence over the continent. Mali's defiance challenges this dynamic, offering a new model for how African nations can navigate the complexities of global power. One of the key lessons that other African nations can draw from Mali's experience is the importance of strategic alliances. By diversifying its international partnerships and engaging with non-Western powers, Mali has increased its leverage and reduced its vulnerability to Western pressure. This approach can be a valuable strategy for other African nations looking to assert their sovereignty. By building relationships with a broader range of global players, African countries can create a more balanced and multipolar world order, where their interests are better represented. Another important lesson is the need for strong, resilient domestic economies. Mali's decision to reject Western aid is only viable because the government believes it can weather the economic challenges that come with it. This highlights the importance of economic independence as a foundation for political sovereignty. African nations must prioritize building strong, self-sufficient economies that are less reliant on foreign aid and more capable of withstanding global economic pressures. This could involve investing in local industries, promoting regional trade, and developing infrastructure that supports economic growth. Mali's stance also highlights the importance of leadership in the struggle for sovereignty. The courage and determination of Mali's leaders have been crucial in driving the country's defiance of Western powers. This highlights the need for strong, visionary leadership across Africa. Leaders who are committed to the principles of sovereignty and who are willing to make difficult decisions in pursuit of these goals. The example set by Mali's leaders could inspire a new generation of African leaders to take bold actions in defense of their nation's independence. Do you think nations like Mali will bring change to Africa? Will this be worth it? What comes after this? Let us know in the comment section. Is it possible that the West let go of its hold in Africa? Or will it fight back? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.